Hello, good afternoon. We are here today for the Menara project in Istanbul with Hamza Medeb and Jalil Lounaz to speak about identity politics in the MENA region. Today at the conference, you were referring to the fact that the Middle East conflicts have actually largely influenced the jihadi movements in the Maghreb. How is it?
Well, thank you for having me here. What we noticed when we analyze the dynamics of conflict in North Africa among the jihadists, here I'm being very specific among the jihadists, we noticed that actually the dynamics of competition among the jihadist groups that exist in the Middle East, for example, between Qaeda and the ISIS and the Nusra versus ISIS, have repercussion in North Africa. So we have major splits within Al-Qaeda affiliated groups in North Africa. I'm talking about here in Algeria and in the Sahel, where you've got former jihadist groups that were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, splitting from Al-Qaeda, pledging allegiance to ISIS. And to that extent, we've got a pattern of competition. They compete for recruitment, compete for allegiances, and so on, with some clashes in North Africa, in Sahel, and as well in Libya and so on. Having said so, what we can see is as well that although we do have this competition, they're not as violent, as intense as what we have in North Africa. They have a tendency to compete for support, for popular support or whatever, but without clashing really violently among them. I mean, we have just a few of clashes here and there, but not more than that.
And in that context of actually competition between jihadi groups, ISIS, AQMI is certainly one of the most successful, even in the Maghreb. How is it today?
ISIS in North Africa is, for the time being at least, and here I'm excluding Libya, Libya's specific case. In Algeria and in the Sahel, it's extremely weak. Okay, Qaeda, the affiliated groups, remain the most powerful ones. We have recently witnessed a unification of all the groups, Salafi groups, jihadist groups affiliated with Qaeda in Mali. In Mali, pledging that all of them came together, AQMI, Morabitoun, the group of Katibat al-Masina, which is affiliated as well, pledging the allegiance to Bin Laden, and to Zawahiri, to Droga being the supreme emir of Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb. To that extent, those groups represent the majority of jihadist groups in the Sahel. Okay, so to that extent, again, we do have this hegemony of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups. We have ISIS still is around, but what we notice is that there's a risk on the long term, not immediately, but in the short and long term, that ISIS actually replaces them eventually. In Libya, on the other hand, and this is why I'm saying this, is because in Libya, on the other hand, we have ISIS in Libya was extremely powerful. Now has been defeated in several key areas of Libya, and they're falling back to the south. So they retreat to the south Libya, which means they may come and reinforce the ISIS groups that are existing already in the south. That's why I'm saying on the short term, I don't think so, but on the mid and long term, it's possible. In addition to this, we have to take into account the return of the foreign fighters to North Africa, which are the North African foreign fighters to Libya and so on.
Okay, and we were actually speaking about jihadism and ISIS, which has always been at the headlines. But Hamza, for you, it is also important to see that there's been a big change for political Islam in the region in general. You've been speaking today about Ikhwanization of, for instance, of Salafi movements. Can you tell us more about this?
Well, since 2011, as you said, there is the fixation on the rise of radical Islam, of Jihadi Islam, which is important and which we cannot neglect. But this fixation has overshadowed deep structural trends within the political Islam landscape in the region, in the whole region. So what we are witnessing, for example, is that the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist movements are facing hard choices in terms of what kind of strategy to adopt, what are the concessions they have and the compromises they have to make, whether in Egypt, whether in Tunisia. And this was the case, especially between 2011 and 13, before the coup d'etat in Egypt. And it's still the case in Tunisia and in Morocco. So these Muslim Brotherhood affiliated movements are faced in or put in front of important dilemmas, which is how to become a ruling party, how to transform themselves into governing parties without losing their historical role of a major player of social and political protest. So, which is completely problematic because their inclusion in the political sphere, their inclusion in the political system will imply automatically, in terms really quasi automatically making concessions, accepting secular constitution, like which was the case in Tunisia in 2014, but also to get accepted by the deep states, which refers to the business networks, to the security services networks, to the bureaucracy, without alienating their own basis or own constituency, their core constituency.
Did you see already some winning situation? Do you think that this strategy can actually work in the future?
I mean, the Nahda in Tunisia are trying really to transform progressively the party toward moving closer to the center of the political spectrum, to widen their audience without losing their constituency. But at the same time, I mean, in Morocco, in Egypt or Tunisia, there is another tendency or another trend, very important trend, which is this competition within the political Islam landscape between the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated movements. The politicization of the Salafis, which meaning the entry to the political arena, to the institutional politics of the Qiitist Salafist movements, who for decades rejected political activism and were concentrated on social activism, preaching, charity, etc., is real novelty in post-2011 context. This is important as it exacerbated the ideology conflicts within the political Islam landscape. It put the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated movements under pressure. It produced a kind of Ikhwanization of the Salafis at some point, because they want to play the role of, and they want to challenge even the Islamists and to replace at some point the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated movements. This explains really the support of the An-Nour party and of the Salafists in Egypt, their support to Sisi coup d'etat against the Muslim Brotherhood. So this competition is really structuring the political Islam landscape. But there is another dynamic which is really important to mention, which is this blurred boundary between the Qiitist Salafism and jihadi Salafism, or armed Salafism, or activist Salafism. Let's say it this way. The case of Madkhali, for example, in Libya, who are now involved in the conflict in Libya, in the armed conflict, fighting against the jihadists and against other armed groups affiliated to the historical trend of the Muslim Brotherhood, etc. So this is also something new, and this shows that really the political context is really important to understand the choices, the options that different trends of political Islam have taken since 2011.
Thank you very much, Hamza Medeb. Thank you, Jalil Lounas. I think you gave a very good idea of the new landscapes and the very moving landscapes of political Islam and jihadism in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.